Cardinal points. Théodule de Veria, 1859.
Joseph said the characters above the man's hand identify him as Shulam. In actuality, the hieroglyphics give his name, Horus. There is no mention of Shulam at all.
The various initial analysis of facsimile 3 is accurate. It is the result of the judgment scene in which the deceased Horus is being brought into the presence of Osiris.
In the year 1912, Franklin S. Spaulding, the Episcopal Bishop of Utah, brought a new round of scrutiny to the Book of Abraham when he asked 8 noted scholars of Egyptology to evaluate the 3 facsimiles. To a man, they agreed that Joseph's explanations were erroneous.
It is difficult to deal seriously with Joseph Smith's imputed fraud. Smith has turned the goddess Isis into a king, and Osiris into Abraham. A.H. Sayce, Oxford University.
These 3 facsimiles of Egyptian documents in the Pearl of Great Price depict the most common objects in the mortuary religion of Egypt. Joseph Smith's interpretation of them as part of a unique revelation through Abraham, therefore, very clearly demonstrates that he was totally unacquainted with the significance of these documents and absolutely ignorant of the simplest facts of Egyptian writing and civilization. Dr. James H. Breasted, University of Chicago.
The Egyptian papyrus, which Smith declared to be the Book of Abraham and translated or explained in his fantastical way, and of which 3 specimens are published in the Pearl of Great Price, are parts of the well-known Book of the Dead. And although the reproductions are very bad, one can easily recognize these familiar scenes. Dr. Eduard Meyer, University of Berlin.
The New York Times took note of Spaulding's findings and issued a blistering 2-page exposé on the Book of Abraham in its December 29, 1912 edition. The Mormon Church could not remain silent in the face of this withering attack on the credibility of Joseph Smith and the Book of Abraham. It offered assurances to the faithful in a 1913 article in its monthly magazine, The Improvement Era. The author, Professor John Henry Evans, argued that it wasn't fair to judge the credibility of Joseph's book by only reviewing the reproduced facsimiles. Evans insisted that to do any reasonable critique would require access to the original documents themselves.
Now, as a matter of fact, the hieroglyphics submitted to the scholars constitute less than 1/7 of the Book of Abraham, and that only an accompaniment of the text. The question therefore becomes, is anyone justified in drawing a conclusion respecting an entire manuscript from a statement which was made with respect to only a very small part of that manuscript, before they would be warranted in saying that the entire Book of Abraham was not properly translated? They would have to examine the original papyrus, or a copy of it. John Henry Evans, Improvement Era, February 1913.
But the original Joseph Smith papyri were gone, almost surely destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Or were they?
But in the spring of 1966, a dramatic discovery was made right here in New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Dr. Aziz Atiyah, a professor of Arabic Studies from the University of Utah, was here doing research when he was approached by the curator of the museum's Department of Egyptian Antiquities, Dr. Henry G. Fisher. Fisher made a startling announcement. The museum had in its archives 11 papyrus fragments that had once belonged to Joseph Smith. Fisher didn't know how the Mormon church leaders would respond to this news, and he was looking for an intermediary. He wondered if Dr. Atiyah, a respected non-Mormon from Salt Lake City, could ask the Mormon church leaders if they would be interested in acquiring the papyri. Negotiations between the Metropolitan Museum and the Mormon Church proceeded, and on November 27, 1967, the museum presented the ancient scrolls to the church. An article in the Deseret News of Salt Lake City announced the gift of 11 papyrus fragments, long believed to have been destroyed in the Chicago Fire of 1871. With the papyri was the original 1856 letter signed by the Mormon prophet's widow, Emma Smith, certifying that the documents had belonged to Joseph Smith.
But did these 11 papyrus fragments include the scroll Joseph identified as a lost book of Abraham? If so, there would finally be an opportunity to vindicate his miraculous claim of discovering and translating a document from the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Of course, there was also the possibility of undermining that claim. The saints waited expectantly and held their breath. Joseph Smith had dictated his translation of the original papyri to his scribes in the 1830s. It was important to identify whether or not the papyri found in the 1960s were the same ones Joseph used during this process. The first clue was the most obvious. The torn picture found in one of the fragments was an identical match to the familiar picture in the beginning of the Book of Abraham. In fact, the tears on the original corresponded exactly to where the Book of Abraham drawings seemed to go awry.
When you have the modern state of the papyrus today in front of you today, or the photographs of it or whatever, and you compare it with the facsimile number 1, you can see that where facsimile number 1 starts to become un-Egyptological, or unexpected from an Egyptological point of view, is pretty much along the line of the present break or destruction of the papyrus. So there's every reason from that point of view to believe that the present condition of the papyrus itself, is as it was in the time of Joseph Smith.
If you took a painting of Madonna and Child and you tore off the heads of both figures and you replaced them with a dog and a cat, it would be as obvious to us now that this was wrong as the replacing of clearly a jackal head with a human head on this Egyptian piece, because we know what these images actually look like. In the same way, we know that those figures would never, under any circumstance, hold a knife. And that's critical to the text itself, because it's not merely decoration for this text. It goes to the core of the supposed story that accompanies it. And if you take the knife away, you've taken the story away as well. And clearly the knife had no reason to be there.
The Book of Abraham itself mentions that this scene appeared at the commencement of the record. In other words, at the beginning of the scroll. Egyptian reads from right to left. And Joseph Smith, who was at the time studying Hebrew, which also reads from right to left, must have surmised this. It seems certain that this piece was the beginning of the scroll used by Joseph Smith. Then another discovery. A sequence of characters on a second piece of papyrus matched exactly a string of characters written in the left column of the translation manuscripts. It appeared that at Joseph's direction, his scribes copied these characters from the papyrus one by one. Joseph then dictated the meaning or translation of each one, often whole paragraphs from a single hieratic character. When Dr. Klaus Baer, professor of Egyptology at the University of Chicago, examined the papyri fragments, he determined that this same piece had at one time been attached to the piece containing facsimile 1. The fibers and edges matched exactly. A third piece was found to include the name Horus, the man for whom the scroll had been prepared. And though the original facsimile 3 has never been found, it also mentions the name Horus. Together, these 4 pieces form virtually the entire scroll in its original form. Finally, scholars could meet the conditions set forth by John Henry Evans way back in 1913. No longer would the critique of the accuracy of the Book of Abraham rely on the facsimiles alone. Now, Egyptologists could read the papyri for themselves and see whether they contained an evil priest's attempt to sacrifice Abraham on an altar, or an account of creation by a multiplicity of gods. In 2001, Dr. Robert Rittner, Associate Professor of Egyptology at the University of Chicago, was commissioned to do a complete translation of the Book of Abraham scroll.
What this document really is an extended prayer on behalf of a